Good evening. I'm attorney Lawrence Berliner. I'm an attorney in the field of special education law. Welcome to everybody who is joining us this evening. In addition, we have Jane Faherty, our co-host. She is the director of the JumpStart program at the Stamford JCC. We are incredibly fortunate this evening to have Susanne Bailey-Rice, an expert in the evaluation and remediation of dyslexia. Just by way of a little introduction, Susanne will be giving a slide presentation on dyslexia. We received many questions prior to this evening's webinar. We hope that the majority of those questions have been answered in Susanne's presentation. We ask that you wait until her presentation to ask questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your computer screen and not the chat. This webinar is being recorded, and whatever's in the Q&A is not recorded, and whatever's in the chat is. By way of a disclaimer, the webinar is being recorded. A copy of the webinar will be provided to each person who is registered after, I believe it's in YouTube, or you get a direct copy. The information does not constitute specific legal, education, or professional advice regarding you or your child's circumstances. It should not be relied upon as such. The webinar does not establish an attorney-client relationship with myself, attorney Lawrence Berliner, a professional relationship with Jane Faherty, the Stamford Jewish Community Center, Susanne Bailey-Rice of Shoreline Learning. By signing up, you've agreed to receive emails about future webinars and events from the Stamford JCC, the Law Office of Lawrence Berliner, LLC. The webinar is being recorded by Zoom, a third-party provider. It's not an agent of or associated with the Law Office of Lawrence Berliner or Jane Faherty or the Stamford Jewish Community Center or Susanne Bailey-Rice. The information we provide in the webinar is based upon Connecticut law. We are all Connecticut-based practitioners. We welcome those who've come from other states and countries, but you need to check your local jurisdiction about the laws and requirements in your state or jurisdiction. We are also following federal law as well. The federal special education law is known as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. If you're watching this webinar from another state or country, please consult your local jurisdiction. Jane and I have been doing this. We're in, I think, our 5th year of doing these webinars. We are very thankful for the people who continue to support us with your presence. And that's very important to Jane and I, because we know you're out there and you are very concerned with the topics and equally inspired by the people we bring onto the webinars who take a lot of time out of their own personal and professional lives to answer questions, provide resources. We are continuing to present our Zoom webinars. We all started out in the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're still continuing in uncharted territories, and that's why Jane and I continue to put on these webinars as often as we can. The need to address social and emotional educational impact upon our children and their educational journey could not be greater. We are here to empower parents for the road ahead. Our special guest, as I mentioned before, is Susanne Bailey-Rice. She is a reading specialist and the founder of the Shoreline Learning, and she will help parents take ownership of the difficult journey they have with their child's reading. We'll be going over the definition of dyslexia, characteristics of dyslexia, what is decoding, pillars of reading, identifying the dyslexic learner, how to help your child at home, types of reading instruction, advocacy, and there are resources available on Susanne's presentation. And we'll take questions to the extent we have a chance to get to all of them. I will say right up front, we have many questions. We just don't have enough time to get all of them, but Jane and I and Susanne will do our best. So Jane, what's new? I haven't seen you in about a month or so.
Hi, good evening, Larry. Good evening, Suzanne. It's lovely to be back again. So I'm Jane. I'm the executive director of a program called JumpStart, which is located in the Stamford JCC, and we have a second classroom in the Maritime Odyssey Preschool in Norwalk. The program typically serves children aged 2 to 3 with developmental delays or disabilities in a one-to-one toddler setting where the children come to enjoy activities for up to 6 hours each week. In addition to that, I have my own private advocacy business and help those children when the time is right, in and around their third birthday, transition into the public school if they are deemed eligible. So it's a privilege to be back here this evening with you, Larry. Dyslexia has always been a very prominent topic of conversation, as is literacy generally, particularly since COVID, when a number of students were recognised and seen to be having significant delays with their linguistic and literacy skills. So it's a real pleasure to have Susan here tonight to help explain some of the questions and help us understand dyslexia in greater detail. And then Lawrence, you and I will be able to ask Susanne some more questions and also tackle questions relating to the legalities potentially, or how to advocate to get the appropriate services and evaluations for students. So it's a delight to have you here tonight, Susan, and we've got lots to get through.
I've had the pleasure of knowing Suzanne Bailey Rice for many years. I first encountered Suzanne at a PPT meeting. Those are IEP meetings in Connecticut parlance, as a special education teacher. And I found her very dedicated, enthusiastic, wanting to be the best she possibly could be as a teacher. And I said to myself, at some point in her career, she's going to open up her own consultation business, which is Shoreline Learning, and she did. So she is an associate level in the Orton Gillingham Association parlance. I believe she's working on the fellow designation, which is the highest level at this point in time. She was a teacher. She has a master's degree in remedial reading. She does evaluations, direct reading instruction through the Shoreline Reading. She's worked at special ed schools besides public schools. And she describes herself, and I agree with her, as a, quote, lifelong learner. And with that, without further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Suzanne.
Thank you so much. So the Orton Gillingham Academy has three, well, they have more than 3 levels, but 3 that I've been going through. So the first level is associate, and that I have completed, and I'm now working towards the certified level. I'm super close. And then the next level would be fellow, which I do intend to keep going as far as I can go, because once I'm at that fellow level, then I can start training other educators and just keep this going. So I'm making my way there, and I will definitely get there. So thank you very much. And it's, always a pleasure to share as much information as I possibly can to, families, to educators. As much as we can spread the information, it's just going to help more and more students. So as much as I can do that, I try to do it as often as possible. So thank you. Okay, so here is our slides, which will be available, and I won't get to, just because we have limited time, I will not get to all of our slides, but I wanted to make sure that they are available because there's so much, and I'm looking for our presentation and talking at the same time, which is not my specialty. Slides. Is my presentation version. Presentation mode, hold on, let's see. I practiced this right before, and now I've lost it because I'm distracted by my talking. Slideshow, there we go. Okay. Whew. Now our technical difficulties are done and we're ready to move on. All right, so I won't get to all of the slides, but I wanted to make sure that they were in here because it's being disseminated to everyone joining tonight. So that way there's links, there's resources, there's so much information in here that we won't have time to get to, but I wanted to at least have it as a resource for later, you know, if someone's watching on Larry's YouTube, or if it's emailed to you and you want to go back to it to say, what was that place that she told me I could get that information, or what did she say about this? It's all in there for you. This is just my information. Like Attorney Berliner had said, Shoreline Learning is in Madison. And this topic is mostly about, as much as I can share about dyslexia. And I always love this cartoon. No matter what I do, I always start with this because I just think it's dyslexia in a nutshell, right? So it's the two little, you know, ants eating cans. One is breadcrumbs and one is pesticide. And the one eating the pesticide is saying, if you ask me, reading is way overrated. Which clearly it's not. He's in for it. But this is something you see, you know, when students come to Shoreline for the first time, they're like, I don't want to read. I don't care. This is dumb. I don't need to do this. I don't need to be here, right? And that's the little ant. They do need to be here. And my thinking is they just need to know the value of what they're about to get. They need to know why is this important and how valuable it is to get this instruction so that they can be successful. So of course, we always need the technical definition of dyslexia. You know, I'm not going to read the whole thing because we have a lot to get through, but this is from the International Dyslexia Association. It has been their formal definition since November 12th of 2002. And it's a specific learning disability. And you'll see that on, you know, some IEPs, SLD, specific learning disability. It's neurobiological in origin. It is seen mostly by fluent word recognition, poor spelling, decoding abilities. These difficulties result typically from a deficit in the phonological component of language, and it's often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities. But the layman's term, what is dyslexia? Non-legal terms. Dys means difficulty. Lexia is words. So if you put that together, it's the difficulty of words, right? Specific learning disability, it's neurobiological. We've learned that in the formal definition. Its characteristics are difficulties with accurate and fluent word recognition, poor spelling, decoding abilities. And students with dyslexia process and interpret information differently. I like to explain it to students as the shortcut versus the scenic route, right? Some of us who, not me, I shouldn't say us, some experience reading very quickly. It comes very naturally. They just pick it up. They recognize the words. It makes sense to them. They're taking the shortcut, right? They see the words. They know what they mean. They can read them with automaticity right away. And then some, it's that scenic route, right? You're taking the long way around. You're using different parts of your brain. And part of Orton-Gillingham, which is something I'm trained in, which we'll get to later in the slides, is it's a way of actually changing your brain, right? This instruction, this methodology actually changes those pathways in your brain to take the shortcut. But that is something that you have to do through multisensory instruction, and it can be done. We actually change brains, which is pretty amazing stuff. Dyslexia affects 15 to 20% of our population, which means 1 in 5 students. You know, in some classrooms, it's more than that. That, you know, may be or maybe not diagnosed yet. What is important to remember is every student is different. I see this a lot when families are coming to me for evaluations, or, you know, maybe just their gut is saying something is off. They've been struggling for a little while, and I know something's wrong, and they're saying they don't like school. They're saying it's hard, but teachers say that they're okay and they're fine and they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, you know. Or some parents will say they're seeing words backwards, or they're reversing letters, or their head hurts when they're reading because the words are wiggling on the page. That's not for every student with dyslexia. Some students with dyslexia do have the wiggling or the reversals, and some don't. It's just struggling to make sense of the words. So every student is different. There's not, you know, one size fits all when it comes to diagnosing students. This is a resource that I love to show. It really kind of shows you 5% learning to read seems effortless. You know, like I said, that shortcut. 35% learning to read is relatively easy with broad instruction. You know, that tier 1 instruction in the classroom, makes sense. They hear it once, they can apply it, and they're good to go. 40 to 50% of a classroom, possibly, learning to read proficiently requires code-based, explicit, systematic, and sequential instruction. These might be your students that are pulled to the back table, right? That are in intervention, RTI, SRBI. They're getting that extra, and then they're like, okay, I'm good to go. This makes sense now. And then you have that 10 to 15% that really learning to read needs code base. They need, Orton Gillingham or Wilson, or that really pulling out daily to learn those patterns. What dyslexia is not. It's not a problem of intelligence. Many students with dyslexia are very gifted artistically, they're athletes, scientifically, they have very logical minds. I always tell my students, if I were to have, 4 teachers come to me looking to be educators at Shoreline Learning, if someone had dyslexia and they said to me, Susanne, I really love to teach. I have dyslexia. It was really challenging for me and I understand it. Absolutely, that would be my choice. For educators or any job, if a student or an adult told me I have dyslexia, I know that they know how to overcome obstacles. They know how to work hard. They, have so many talents, and they just need possibly some accommodations. That's great. So, they just work so hard and they have so many strengths to celebrate. Dyslexia is not a vision problem or just reading backwards or reversing letters. It's not something you outgrow, but with early intervention and appropriate accommodations, literacy outcomes greatly improve. It's not something cured with just vision therapy, color overlays. It's not, there's not a quick fix. It's something that is fixed with education, explicit instruction over time. It's not a difficulty due to lack of exposure or instruction. This comes up a lot in, PPTs or intervention meetings. Is it dyslexia or is it lack of instruction? Sometimes students are struggling because of lack of instruction. That doesn't mean they automatically have dyslexia. Now, the instruction that we would provide would be very similar, right? Good instruction that's multisensory, that's explicit and diagnostic and prescriptive, that would help any student, whether it was lack of instruction or dyslexia. But just because they don't have the skills doesn't necessarily mean it's dyslexia, and we'll get to that a little bit later in the slides. It's not laziness. They're working so hard. The students are often exhausted when they get home. They're putting so much effort into everything they're doing every day. They're taking that long road. So to get to what they need to get done is absolutely exhausting for them. And one of the questions, and I tried to take, we had a lot of questions come in, so I tried to take as many as I possibly could and add them to the slides so that we answer them as I'm presenting. And this was one of them. Are students with dyslexia negatively labeled? This was, when I was going through school, this was a fear of a lot of students, of a lot of families. You didn't want to be diagnosed because that meant you were different. That means you struggled, you were in a different classroom. And that is not the case anymore. It is not. A lot of families are really fighting to get diagnosed because that's what's going to get your students the services and the help that they need. So it's no longer like that. Any typical classroom in any district that I've worked with is students are coming and going from classrooms constantly. It's not just one person coming in and taking a student and everyone turns around where they're going. Now it's more, oh, where you get to go? Can I come too? It's such the norm now for students to be pulled out for so many different reasons that it's not a negative label at all. I don't see that in any of the schools that I work in or districts that I work with. So what are the signs of dyslexia? A student who is below grade level on written language, a student who we need to take a closer look at, right? So any of the, the difficulty with phonological processing, that's phonemic awareness, that's the foundation of literacy. Difficulty learning the alphabet, that is something we can catch. Those two are right at the very, very start of schooling, you know, preschool and kindergarten. Difficulty decoding words, especially nonsense words. Sometimes students with dyslexia are so bright and have amazing vocabulary and have the strengths to, when they're reading, even though they're struggling to get through that text, they can comprehend because they can infer and they can use contextual clues that you don't necessarily know it, but they're memorizing, right? They're so bright, they have that background knowledge. So with real words, they've memorized so many just from exposure that those nonsense words really give us that clue into, well, they don't know that word. It's a new word. It's not familiar to them. So can they decode it? So those nonsense words are a really big piece of the puzzle to suss out that memorizing versus decoding. If a student is disfluent or really has labored reading, poor handwriting, poor spelling, poor written expression, and what's most important, I feel, for parents is to start seeing that they dislike or avoid literacy tasks, right? If they're like, no, I don't want to read tonight, or, you know, I'm too tired, or school was really hard, we had to write or we had to read. When you can start to see their confidence go, or they dislike any of those activities, or they don't want to write thank you notes after the holidays or after a birthday. Any of those dislikes, those avoiding, those confidence pieces are really things that you want to keep a close eye on, because parents know best, right? Parents, we know our students, we know our children, and, you know, listening to that gut, if you think something is off, it may be, and it's worth taking a look at. So you really, as parents, we have to trust our guts on that one. This is something the National Reading Panel identified 5 key concepts at the core of every effective reading instruction program: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. This was released in 2000, still stands today. There's a lot of research based on these 5 pillars. I tried to put my source on every, you know, image that I borrowed from the internet or any of the websites that I'll share later in the slides, so that if you're going to look for more information or you want to look at research behind any of these images, the source is right on the slideshow for you. And then to go in a little bit more detail of each of these pillars so that you know what they are, is phonemic awareness is the ability to identify the different sounds that make up speech. This is where you hear phonological awareness. You know, teachers might be using Haggerty, they might be using David Kilpatrick. One of the tests that you often might see in your evaluations is the C-top. And this is really the foundation of reading. It's can you manipulate sounds without putting any visual to it? Just listening. It's word games, rhyming, tongue twisters, you know, saying bat without b, and really being able to manipulate those sounds without the visual aspect to it. And, you know, many in the Orton Gillingham world will say it's an activity you can do with your eyes closed. So you don't need anything in front of you. And then you go to the phonics, which helps kids match the sounds to the letters or the letter groups. Now you're adding the letters in, that letter identification. What does this say? You're doing auditory drills and visual drills where, you know, I might have a student writing down, I'll say, what says ch? And they have to know what says ch, ch, and they'll write ch on the page. And on the opposite of that, I'll show them a card that says ch, and they'll have to say ch, chin, ch, or eventually when we don't need that keyword, they'll just say ch. And then you get to fluency, which is the ability to read accurately and quickly. It's achieved when the reader can concentrate on the meaning of the text, not the individual words. It's putting it all together. It's that automaticity. They're not stopping to decode every single word, but it's really coming along with prosody, and they can put meaning to all of that. And then vocabulary is the key to knowing more about everything. You know, I've had the students with dyslexia that have amazing vocabularies, and that helps them, right? It gives them a tool in their toolbox. It helps them compensate for some of the struggles in their actual decoding. But on the other hand, if they don't know that vocabulary, they can be decoding the word accurately, but they've never heard the word before. They don't know the meaning of the word. So they're decoding it, but they say it again and again, and they don't know that it's correct because they didn't have the vocabulary. So that's also a very important part of any lesson that we provide for students, is knowing what the words mean, right? Adding to that vocabulary if that's not already a strength for them. And then comprehension happens when the words become ideas. Once they're reading fluently with a strong vocabulary, they can read for understanding. It's that, oh, I get it now moment. And again, comprehension, students can have an amazing comprehension, even if they're struggling to decode. Or the other side, they could be decoding perfectly, but then they read it and it's just not there. One of the questions was, the difference between fluency and comprehension, and talking a little bit more about those. And, there's a lot to fluency and there's a lot to comprehension. Those are, areas that you really have to dig in deeper as an educator and say, well, why aren't they reading fluently? Is it because they don't know the words and it's more of a vocabulary? Is it because they're taking so much time to decode that they're missing the whole sentence put together and they're missing that meaning? Or is it a tracking, right? And they're losing their place and they have to keep going back, or they skip lines. So it's really those, to look at an evaluation, it's going beyond just the scores. If you see fluency or, and you're like, but why? Why is that score low is really where you need to dig in. And the same as with comprehension. Is it a memory piece? Is it the decoding? Is it the fluency? Is it the vocabulary? Is it the language piece? So there's a lot of, all of those pillars you really need to dig in deeper as an evaluator. There was a lot of questions related to the assessments to find out if a student has dyslexia, or what type of instruction do they need, how often do they need instruction. And this is just my list of assessments that, and I don't do them for every student, that would be torturous, but it really depends on the student. It depends on what questions we're looking to answer. My goal whenever I do a formal literacy or academic assessment is to have 2 measures for each of those pillars. So if we're talking about comprehension, I want to have a listening comprehension. I would like to have a silent reading comprehension and an oral reading comprehension, because if you have all 3 of those, you can really then say, okay, what is the difficulty? A lot of times there's a pretty good discrepancy between the listening comprehension and the reading comprehension. So again, with any of the assessments that you do, you really want to dig in deep to the why. Why is that happening? And learning as much as you can about the student's learning profile so that we can give them the appropriate IEP or the appropriate instruction for success. And some of these, obviously, you wouldn't give. There's the test of written language and the test of early written language. That is determined by the student's age. So not all of these are appropriate for every age student. So you really kind of narrow down what are the questions we need to answer. We want to give a very comprehensive evaluation to get as much information as we can. But we also don't want to go overboard and test a student more than we have to. So it's really that balance of what do we need to know and to learn the student's profile and provide the most appropriate education. I also like to include informal assessments, because often my evaluations are presented to their public school or their private school to help them understand the student's learning profile and provide that instruction. So giving those informal assessments allow me to kind of provide that, what should the objectives be, right? It gives that nitty-gritty information of what skills, the GE test of coding gives every skill along a scope and sequence. So you can really narrow down those specific skills that they may be lacking or that may be areas of concern. And it also gives the school the baseline information. So now they have the baseline data so that when they start providing that instruction, they have that data to then watch the growth over time. So I try to include both formal and informal for that reason. One of the, or a few of the questions that came up related to the assessments are, do you diagnose? So I do not diagnose in my assessments. I try to make as clear as possible without diagnosing whether I feel the student has dyslexia. I will say things like, this student shows characteristics of a student with dyslexia. I cannot diagnose, a neuropsych eval can diagnose, but I cannot. But I can certainly provide lots of information, a very comprehensive look at the student's learning profile and what I feel that student needs in the classroom setting or outside of the classroom setting. And then how can you identify dyslexia in kindergarten? You know, what are the red flags? How can you assess alphabet skills? This kind of go together of, you know, back to those pillars and back to that specific skills that the student maybe have gaps in their learning, or they might have splintered skills. Alphabet skills, I am having students when they come in, no matter what age, whether they are, you know, 3. I have students here at Shoreline learning from age 3 up to 24. And every student that comes in will say the alphabet. I have them write the alphabet in all uppercase and write the alphabet in all lowercase. And it's surprising how many students at those upper levels really struggle to do so. You know, it's been since kindergarten that they've written the alphabet and they forget. And also at those upper levels, I often have students that have difficulties saying the alphabet. You know, it's been so long, or providing what sounds do each letter make. You know, usually the XYZ is what gets my older students. They don't remember those sounds, which if they're trying to decode unknown words and they don't know the sounds for all the letters, that's going to be really challenging for them. So, you know, even the older students, I go back to those alphabet skills, those very foundations, to make sure that those are solid so that we can build upon them. Okay, so these are just definitions. You know, these are words that you'll hear in meetings or when you're going over evaluations. The science of reading, structured literacy, you'll hear, you know, Orton Gillingham, Wilson. One of the questions was, is OG the gold standard? I'm partial on that because that's where my training is. So I don't know that I can give a professional answer for that, but I will say, you know, when I was looking, and I've shared this with Jane and Attorney Berliner, that, you know, I went to school for a degree in regular education. My first master's was in special education, and I was a special educator for about 4 years. And I started getting more and more students who needed to learn how to read. And I didn't know what to do. And I panicked because I said, well, I'm the last stop. I'm the one that is supposed to be giving them this information on how to decode what's in front of them. And I didn't learn it in school. I didn't learn it in my college. I didn't learn it in my master's. And that scared me. And I said, well, I'm the last stop. I have to get this information. So I poured through Google, and where do I go and how do I get this knowledge so that I can teach students? And everything I looked on said, based on Orton Gillingham, you know, the Wilson, based on the methodology of Orton Gillingham. So my thought is, well, if everything's based on it, that must be where I should go. So, you know, that's where I went. That's where I started my training. That was back in, my goodness, I think 2014, or yeah, I think it was about 14, 15. And that's when I started, and I'm still in my training, and I will continue to do that, because the more that we can learn, the more students we can help, because like I said, every student is different. So the more tools we have in our toolbox that we can provide to students, the better off they will be. So I'm partial. I do think OG is the gold standard, but there are amazing resources, which I will put in, you know, that are in the slides for everyone to look at. There's just so many options for learning more about, you know, the science of reading, structured literacy, or Gillingham. It's all in here. So at the end of the day, instruction should be explicit, prescriptive, and diagnostic. I mean, that is huge. If you are explicitly teaching them how to decode and how to do all of those 5 pillars, and you're being prescriptive. You're looking at their errors. Why did they make this error? Is there a pattern of their errors? Are they always making errors related to the same skills? And then you're taking that information that you're reflecting on and you're being diagnostic. You're then making that their next lesson, right? All errors are going into the next lesson. You're constantly reviewing and reflecting on everything you teach so that it can be cyclical, right? You can continue to teach and not just teach twice and move on, but really keep cycling that skill into lessons after lessons to assure that it's at the mastery level and they will remember that skill and not just forget it if they're not doing it. A lot of questions were on teenagers, on early intervention, adults, what can we do at home? What should the school be doing? This may sound strange because there's such different students at 3 or at, high school or at age 24. I don't diagnose differently, right? What are these skills from the very beginning of a scope and sequence to adults, right? That we would be reading at a college level. There is a scope and sequence, and I really try to start what is the very first skill that students need to learn. And no matter what age a student is that comes to me, I'm looking at that very foundation. And then I'm going to see where we hit the ceiling, right? So where did they start? What are the gaps? Where are those splintered skills? And then we're going to fill those gaps. So the diagnosis, although I might use different measures for different ages, I'm still looking at that whole span of skills with every student to make sure that there are no holes in the foundation. And what age is common? Like I said, I have students from age 3 to 24. I have many high school students who come in and are being diagnosed for the first time, which is heartbreaking to me, but I'm thrilled that they find, someone to evaluate them and give them that instruction at any age. But usually with older students, I hear, I get nervous that they're going to read the report and they're going to be upset because their confidence is already a little bit low. And then they say, oh, thank God somebody finally gets me. And that always just tears at my heart because, you can understand someone and then finally give them what they need, which is an amazing thing. And then services and interventions, individual instruction versus groups. These always come up at meetings after evaluations. How much support is appropriate? Is, push into the classroom versus pulling out of the classroom? Which box should we check on the IEP? And I know probably no one will like this answer, but it depends, right? It depends on the student. Every student is so different. One of the things that I do kind of not push for, but strongly encourage at meetings is for pull-out services. Push in services. I really try to reserve for once the student gets that information, once they have the explicit instruction, then when we want to make sure that that information is generalizing, it's amazing to have someone in the classroom who understands that and has been trained in structured literacy that can really make sure, or if they're writing in the classroom, ooh, I see that G, what does it say, J or G? So to have that as that generalization piece. But really for that beginning explicit instruction, I would want to see that push, that pull out instruction. And then really when they're ready to, kind of fly on their own, then the push in is how I see it appropriate. But how much support and, whether it's individual or groups, it really depends on the student. How much ground do they have to make up? How much time do they have in their schedule? Do we only do a little bit during the school day and the rest needs to be after the school day? Because we don't want them being pulled out of ELA time or literacy time. You really want them to get that double dip, right? You want them exposed to their grade level literacy and then have the explicit instruction to fill those gaps afterwards. So, it really is a discussion at the PPT meeting to what is most appropriate for that student. And I'm just going to go back because I wanted to make sure. This was the other question. They qualified for services. What is next? So, once you have the evaluation, and Attorney Berliner, I'm sure will speak to this as well, but once you have the evaluation, you learn the student's profile and you do the accommodations. The meeting to discern what the services are, what's next. Okay, so then you have 10 days after the meeting, they get the IEP going, and then it's the data, right? So it's, what does the data look like? Are they making growth? That kind of thing. So, there's more slides that we'll go into more, but there is a process, and, Attorney Berliner can speak to that as well. But it's, gaining this information, these assessments are the first step of gaining that, getting the qualification, and then it's putting an appropriate IEP in place, or SRBI, RTI. It's getting that instruction in place and then watching that data over time. Accommodations. This is always a big one, and I tried to squeeze a lot on this slide. Again, it really depends on the student. Every student with dyslexia is different in their needs, but it's providing, auditory, visual, kinesthetic opportunities, repeating directions, extra time. There's so many here. One thing I really caution is sometimes the difference between accessing the curriculum and giving them tools to access what they need to in the classroom, but also maintaining that they are getting the instruction they need to do it without the technology. That's a big piece for me. A lot of times in meetings you hear, well, we're not going to do this handwriting, or we're not going to do spelling because they have spell check, or because they have, Google Read Write, or they have technology, so we don't need to focus on that, or we don't need a goal for that. And I would say there are so many opportunities or situations where you need to handwrite still, believe it or not. Even though we have phones, we have technology, there are times in classrooms where, assessments need to be handwritten, essays. A lot of the honors classes that my students take are, the essay has to be handwritten for the exam or in the classroom, or they're doing quick writes, or, filling out an application at a doctor's office. There are a lot of opportunities where students need to handwrite, and it needs to be legible, and they need to feel confident that they can spell accurately on those papers, so it's while accommodations and assistive technology are so important for students in the classroom to kind of lessen that anxiety or that stress, or help them take notes quicker, or annotate their work, they're amazing and they should absolutely be available. But we also need to make sure that we're teaching them those skills outside of the assistive tech. And, technology is always a big one. Well, what should we do? Or, okay, that's great, we have an AT eval, but what can we use? So I just listed, and I'm not going to go through them. They're here, and I've tried to separate them into writing engagement, digital storytelling, writing, mind mapping, all different categories, so that we can try to do, you can look them up and see. And then this is another one from the International Dyslexia Association Oregon branch. They put a great graphic up with a lot of different apps and technology that they recommend, just for looking at. And again, it depends on the student. It depends on the age level of what is appropriate and what will be helpful. And, things that I love Grammarly. I love Google Read Write. Some students hate them. They're like, no, I hate that it's always popping up. I hate that squiggly line. So it really is, learning to use it and seeing what works best for you. And everyone is a little different when it comes to that. This is the graphic they have. It's not one size fits all. It's personal, and it needs to be explicitly taught. So I would say anytime you're in a meeting and, assistive tech is on the table and they say, sure, we'll pay for the premium version of Google Read Write, they put it in the IEP, but we don't know how to use it. I have a student that I'm working right now at a college level, and the college gave a program for taking notes, and but she didn't know how to use it. And, you know, I said, okay, so show me this program. This is one I've never heard of, you know, show me how it works. And she said, well, I don't know. I think you just record it. I'm like, yeah, but then what? Then where does it go? Is it organized? Can you make note cards with it? So, you know, the explicitly taught is really an important part of it. You know, think about when we get a new phone or a new iPad, it's great and it's exciting, but there's a learning curve. So, you know, that is a big part of it. It takes practice.
Somebody is saying they can't hear. Just speak a little louder, please.
Oh, yeah, of course. Sorry. And what can a parent do when you suspect or learn that your child may have dyslexia? Like I've said at the beginning, trust your gut. Ask for data and document. Start a binder to collect everything. You know, I always love when parents come to me and they open up the binder and they say, okay, so this was their first IEP. This is when they were in intervention. To have it all organized and documented is amazing. But again, you know, trusting your gut is the biggest thing. If they're struggling and you see them struggling, you think something might be, it probably is, you know, and it may not be dyslexia, it may not be a learning disability, but it's something. It's something sharing that they need instruction, they need support. So act on that. You know, districts do universal assessments, they have intervention. Where is that data? How long have they been in intervention? What is the goal you're working on? And what is that growth over time? Is the intervention working? If it's not, what else can we try? So really just having that team relationship with the district and watching that data over time so that if it's not working, we can act quickly and not let a whole school year go by. And have those meetings, you know, conferences with the interventionist, with the classroom teacher. What are you seeing? What does that look like in the classroom? And the biggest thing for me is empowerment, right? Changing that mindset from I can't do it. Okay, but you can't do it yet. What can we do to help you? What can we help? And teaching students to know themselves as learners, know what they need, and also how to get it, right? How to advocate for their needs. This is really hard for me because, or can you print that for me? You know, students at the high school level that really struggle to take notes. Can you print those notes for me, or can you print out the study guide for me so that I can fill it in as I'm listening? But really advocating for their needs. And this is another favorite of mine is I would argue that children with dyslexia are born to stand out. Let's not force them to fit in, right? They learn differently. They're taking the long road. They don't have to take the fast road, right? They don't have to, but we don't want them to struggle silently. We want to help them so that they can stand out in their way. And then home support is learning about their strengths, areas to focus and expression on, help them discover who they are, empower them, teach them how to communicate, encourage them to advocate, try new strategies, provide support, and really importantly is gather their team, right? Their teachers, their advocates, their mentors, ask for help and kind of start getting that team together. And the rest of the slides are really just, I'm not going to go too much in detail. I just wanted you to have them. A lot of families say, what can I do at home? They're exhausted. They don't want to do anything. Homework is a struggle. Reading aloud to them is perfect. If they have a chart that you have to sign every night, read 20 minutes a night at school, read to them. That's reading, and it has such an important aspect to it. It builds their empathy. It creates a lifelong love of learning, of reading. They still are getting vocabulary, learning, listening skills. It improves their language. It facilitates those conversations and empowers their imagination. So reading aloud to them is just as important as them reading. And then the rest are just really some amazing resources. These are books that have students in them with dyslexia for all different ages of students. These are more parent reads of just really good information about dyslexia, about dysgraphia, dyscalculia. This one, the teacher who couldn't read, is an amazing story of, you know, a man, and he was a teacher and he couldn't read. And he was using his compensation skills, his memorizing, his contextual clues to really get through. And then he realized like, I should really do something about that. Kind of like me with teaching, but he couldn't read. So that's an amazing story as well. And then these are just a bunch of links and stories and educators and speakers and just amazing things for all ages to kind of look through and learn about. These are all links for resources, the International Dyslexia Association, the Department of Ed, Understood, Decoding Dyslexia, Connecticut Reading League, just amazing, amazing resources that I suggest that you kind of reach out and try to get to. And that's it. I tried to go as fast as I could, but it's a lot of information.
But this has been fantastic. So you've given us a great understanding in terms of what dyslexia is and some of the tools that can be used to identify whether it's a screening tool or then strategies that parents can use at home as well. So Larry, in terms of the technicalities of this, are there any regulations to ensure students with dyslexia do receive some of the strategies that Susan mentioned and that do receive the research-based reading instructions?
Excellent question. Unfortunately, it's sort of how high is up is the answer. Yes, there are regulations, there are state regulations, there are federal regulations, there are policies, but where the rubber meets the road, something is missing. So I could tell you the Code of Federal Regulations talk about learning disabilities, but not necessarily dyslexia. I can refer parents to the State Department of Education website here in Connecticut and elsewhere, and you'll read a whole bunch of information about dyslexia, but there's no common definition in the regulations. Besides that, it varies from school district to school district here in Connecticut how dyslexia is identified, how services are provided. Susanne talked about group versus individual instruction, push-in services, pull-out services. It's a resource issue. And this is why parents, as Susanne pointed out several times, are very important sources of information. Trust your gut. Don't let your gut or any other part of your body talk you out of what you feel or know about your child. Because if you don't see it at home, then how do you know what's going on at school? Because the purpose of school is to teach a skill and eventually generalize that skill to other settings, home, community, jobs, social situations. And if you're not seeing that, where or why is there a disconnect? I give my clients a PhD in clinical parenting. Why? Because you are experts on your child, and don't forget that. So if it doesn't sound right, feel right, it probably isn't. And that's where getting school district evaluations, private evaluations, such as Suzanne Bailey Rice, can help a parent become informed. Maybe they're just about to turn the corner and they just need a little extra support. That's where response to intervention might come into play. Sometimes they have a learning disability, dyslexia, or other kinds of learning disability. And that's where information is key to getting evaluations, getting to a PPT or an IEP meeting, getting an IEP if eligible, having goals and objectives, identify the areas of weakness, having goals, accommodations to remediate those areas of weakness. And after a reasonable period of time, parents should be able to see meaningful progress. Meaningful progress is what the United States Supreme Court called a free, appropriate public education. Not trivial progress, not no progress, worse regression, but meaningful progress. And if you're not seeing the meaningful progress, speak to the teacher. Get an evaluation, go to a PPT meeting, get private services. Some parents are able to get private tutorial services to help close the gaps that they know are occurring. So as Suzanne said, there's no one size fits all. Unfortunately, in Connecticut, we don't have a very clear set of regulations. We have guidelines. There's I think it's called a working definition of dyslexia. Well, we've been working on that definition since 2014. We're still working on it.
So if a family has already gone through the IEE process and reading comprehension, working memory, are they still able to do a deeper dive and request an evaluation specifically for dyslexia? And Susan, is that something that you could participate in? So it's a question to both Larry and Susan.
Yeah, oftentimes parents will come to me and say, you know, the school has already done their evaluation, but I just think there's something that I don't know yet, or I don't see the explicit skill breakdown of where they're falling apart. You know, there might be some areas that are below average, but I need more information. Or maybe the school only did a few assessments, but they didn't do a really comprehensive look. And then, yes, I would absolutely add to that testing and provide more information to really get at that nitty-gritty of where do we need to help them, where are those gaps.
You know, the deeper the dive, the better as far as I'm concerned. And all due deference to school districts, sometimes they're only able to hit a few high points because of the volume and demand on the resources and their ability. And that's where getting a private evaluation, somebody could spend a little more time, do a deeper dive, might find what's really going on to the extent that the school's evaluations have only hit a few high points. And Susanne had quite a few. They're all acronyms of the various language-based reading literacy assessments that are out there, and I'm sure there are many more. And we're just trying to get that proverbial finger on the pulse of what is making the child succeed or worse, not succeed in school.
So Larry, if an evaluation has been completed and everybody at the PPT meeting has agreed and determined that child does indeed have dyslexia and the appropriate methodologies or reading programs should be implemented, what should a parent do and where should they go to report that a school is not applying a 504 plan or an IEP properly and not addressing these specific needs?
Well, there's not a place to go like, you know, reporting suspected, you know, child abuse or neglect. Where you go is starting with reading your procedural safeguards if your child has a 504 plan, or reading your procedural safeguards if they have an IEP. Those are your rights. Those are your child's rights. There are more rights with an IEP than a 504 plan, but there are rights. They are enforceable. How they're enforceable is different. A 504 plan, you have a 504 plan meeting. However, there's no specific right to a due process hearing. You can request a hearing, but it's not the same as a special ed due process hearing. You could file a discrimination complaint with the U.S. Department of Education Office of Civil Rights. You could file a lawsuit in federal court. That's how Section 504 is enforced. With special education, it's much different. You usually are back to a PPT meeting, an IEP meeting outside of Connecticut, and you want to build a record, present your concerns for enhancing your child's education. That's a paraphrase of the federal regulation. The PPT needs to consider parents' concerns for enhancing their child's education. If you reach a consensus opinion, great. That's obviously my preference, that everybody is listening to one another and we reach an agreement. If there's no agreement, we separate into us versus them. That's where the procedural safeguards come into play. One of the many procedural safeguards, and there are about 20, involves an independent education evaluation. If you disagree with the school's evaluation, parents have a right to request a publicly funded independent evaluation with an evaluator of their choice, such as Susanne. The school has two choices. They can say yes or no. If they say yes, they'll pay for the evaluation, provided the evaluator meets the qualifications for an outside evaluation. If they say no, they have to take a parent to a due process hearing. There's a third option, which is not in the law, but sometimes we have a mutually agreed upon evaluator. We give the school district several names, they give us several names, and if one of those names is on both lists, by design or default, that's the mutually agreed upon evaluator. The important thing is not proving who's right or wrong, because the child gets lost in the process. This is about the student. It's not about the teacher. It's not about the parent. It's about the child who's not succeeding in school. So read the procedural safeguards, know how to exercise those rights, whether it's a 504 plan or a due process hearing. Check out the myriad of resources at the end of Suzanne's slide presentation. There are a lot of information available on the State Department of Education website, the International Dyslexia Association website, the Orton Gillingham website. There's an organization, Decoding Dyslexia Connecticut. Another resource, Special Ed Resource Center, which is part of the State Department of Education. These are all important resources so parents can empower themselves, and that way they can teach their child to empower themselves as well.
This is an interesting question. And I actually had a conversation with a parent yesterday about this same subject. How can we, and this is to you, Susanne, how can we know that dyslexia is the barrier to a Down syndrome child, or it could be another diagnosis that a child has? How can you tease out one diagnosis versus dyslexia, or the combination of the two elements?
So you can't always tease out, there's always a lot of comorbidities, right? So many students with dyslexia also have ADD or ADHD. There's always many layers, right, to a student's profile. Many times it's not just one diagnosis. There might be anxiety, there might be many, it might be dysgraphia and dyslexia, it might be dyscalculia and dyslexia. So there's often many layers. So it's sometimes hard to tease out, just like what box to check on an IEP when you're saying, yes, they qualify for special education, but what do we check? For me, it's sometimes you have to check the box to get the services, right? So sometimes it's really important to families which box to check. But what I like to focus on is, as long as they're getting what they need, right? As long as the IEP being built is giving them the services that they need to be successful, to me, I don't care what box is checked. So that's part of it. But the other part is you can't always tease it out. So I have worked with many students with Down syndrome and provided Orton Gillingham instruction. That was a big question a couple of years ago with several of my students with Down syndrome. That's, well, can they do OG? They're not learning the same as some people say typical student. So, can you do OG for a student with Down syndrome? And yes, you absolutely can. OG is a methodology, right? It's a way of teaching that's multisensory. Like I said, it's diagnostic, prescriptive, which works for every student. Any learner would benefit from the methodology of Orton Gillingham. So yes, absolutely. You may not tease out whether it's dyslexia or the Down syndrome or intellectual disability, but the instruction is the same. They can benefit from it. I've seen amazing growth with students with Down syndrome using the Orton Gillingham methodology. So.
And how often do you see a correlation between a child that's struggling with their literacy and speech and language development?
It's so intertwined, which is why I have a speech and learning center upstairs of Shoreline Learning, because it is so intertwined. Speech and language and literacy instruction overlap constantly. And that when I started Shoreline Learning, that was one of my big pieces, is because families are going all over the state for different services, to have them all in one location. We have an occupational therapist that comes in as needed, but the speech and language is upstairs all the time, every day, because it is so intertwined. So she has students that come to her, and then she says, I think there's something more here. I'll go talk to Suzanne downstairs. And I do the same. And I say, there might be articulation, or there might be that understanding of language that is a little bit more than just decoding, encoding, and comprehension, but it's a little bit more. So, I'll send them upstairs to Sarah. So, it's so intertwined that it's really important to have, both of those pieces.
And is that true too of older students that you might be working with? Because I think there's some fallacy that once a child gets to a certain age, maybe they no longer need speech.
And I think a lot of, and I'm not a speech expert, that's why I have someone upstairs. You know, but a lot of people, when they think of speech, they think of, you know, just the articulation, or, you know, they have a hard time with their R's, or, you know, maybe it's the tenses, you know, that kind of thing. But there's so much more that a speech pathologist can provide to a student based on language. There's so much more than just the articulation. So it's definitely a piece of the puzzle. You know, when you're planning that evaluation, having a speech therapist really come to that table with their report and do their comprehensive piece as well is a big piece of the puzzle that you don't want to forget.
Larry, this is a question for you. What language or words can a parent use when questioning the school about not providing adequate support in the literacy realm for their child? Is there any key buzzwords or conversational points that the parent should highlight and pick up at a PPT meeting?
Great question. One answer I provided a few moments ago, and that is there's a lack of meaningful educational progress. And the other one is we don't see it at home. You know, the child may be making satisfactory progress at school, getting all A's, but we don't see those skills generalized to home. So there's no one size fits all language. Everybody has their own vocabulary, their own ways of expressing themselves. Silence is not one of the ways. Being intimidated at these PPT meetings is not helpful to the child. Being prepared with data. My favorite story was many years ago. I had a parent who came in with I think it was a spelling test where the child had 5 out of 10 questions answered correctly, and she received an A. And the parent showed that to me and said, this isn't right. So we go to the PPT meeting and she takes out that spelling test. Now, but the way I would grade that, you get 10 out of 10 A, 8 out of 10 B, 7 out of 10. 5 out of 10 should have been an F. So I asked the teacher, why did you give the child an A? And I said, and the teacher said, I didn't want the child to feel bad about herself. And I said, I agree. I don't want to feel bad, self-esteem, you know, whatever, but what are you teaching this child? You can do half the work and get an A. That means you can go to half the classes in college and get an A. You can do half the work at a job and get a full paycheck. That's what you're teaching this child. So I said, if you want to teach this child, let her retake the test, provide her some kind of instruction, help the parents at home. Maybe there's something they can do and Suzanne's slides talked about that as well, that parents can do at home to reinforce a skill supposedly learned at school. And as I mentioned, sometimes parents hire private, you know, instructors, tutors.
Yeah, and I think another important piece is if a student is seeing an outside provider, you know, whether it's tutoring or, you know, a tutor coming into the school or coming to, you know, Shoreline Learning after school, a big piece is the communication with the district. I mean, that is huge. And I always, parents ask, do you communicate with the skills? And I said, as much as they'll allow me to. You know, some schools are very open and love the communication back and forth, so much so that we have a shared Google document. And, you know, every time I work with a student, I put in what we worked on, what their errors were, and what my plan is for the next session. And then they'll do the same, and we're using the same language. And that is so amazing for that student. And then other schools are like, nope, we've got it, you know, and it's just kind of two silos working side by side. And it's still going to benefit the student, but it could benefit them so much more. So that communication of that home school, you know, home team and school team is crucial if the school is willing to do that. It makes a big difference.
So Larry, in the last 5 years, we've spoken a trends map about meaningful progress and data collection. And we had a question in tonight that said, is there a legal definition for meaningful progress? And then the other follow-up to that question is, they believe, is it true that an evaluation report without recommendations is not legally defensible in a court system? If you have any suggestions on those two.
Not on the very last point, but meaningful progress, I do. We all start with a baseline. And against that baseline, typically an evaluation, a work sample, whatever you want to use as a baseline, and against that baseline, are we seeing the gaps close? So if we see letter reversals, for example, is that increasing or decreasing? Are we unable to spell? Is that increasing or decreasing? I've had many students, the school swears on a stack of Bible they're reading, but when the child reads to the grandparents a novel book that's not, they haven't memorized, the grandparents said, what's going on here? Our grandchild can't read. And the parents didn't quite understand that, because when the child was reading, quote, quote, at home, it sounded like they were reading. So it's very important, whatever measures, formal or informal, you judge it against a baseline. Now, part of that baseline can be standardized testing, informal testing. Some of those are on one of the slides in Suzanne's presentation. Others are work samples. Is this acceptable at age, grade, or developmental levels? And if the answer is no, then parents need to ask the question and politely request, or if necessary, demand the answer. And that might be understanding better the assessments. A lot of this is, I say this affectionately, not in a pejorative way, psychobabble. Parents may not understand the lingo of what the teachers and the evaluators, and it's very important to have a common understanding of what these words mean, what these test scores mean, what is average, what is above average, below average, and that's how you can measure meaningful progress. What the Supreme Court looked at was trivial progress is not meaningful progress, so they more or less helped us understand what trivial progress was, but they didn't quite tell us what meaningful progress. So I just use a standard as follows. Does your child know more today than a year ago? Just go back 1 year, that's your baseline. I'll go back to the last report card or progress report or evaluation report. Are the numbers going up or down? Are the skills improving, going sideways, or worse, regressing? So there's not an exact answer. The most important one is parents trusting their instincts, their knowledge of their child. If it doesn't feel right, it doesn't sound right, it probably isn't. We're getting very close to the end of our presentation. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions, but we hope the majority of them were covered by Suzanne's website. And presentation and information that will be available on her website or the websites that are referred to in that presentation. So I want to thank all the participants who are still here, and there are quite a few. I want to thank Jane and Suzanne. Jane and I will be having our next webinar on March 12th. This will be more or less a roundtable as we've had before, with Ali Grafman, a special education advocate from ABC Advocacy. We will try to get to your questions if you send them to us ahead of time, as many of you have done before. If you found tonight's webinar informative, please do not hesitate to register for the next webinar on March 12th. If you have a YouTube channel, this information will be on the YouTube channel for the Law Office of Lawrence Berliner, as our previous webinar recordings. I want to thank our special guest this evening, Suzanne Bailey Rice, for taking time out of her very busy personal life and professional schedule, and Jane Faherty, our co-host. I also want to thank my daughter, Rachel, who's off camera to my immediate right, because without Rachel, none of these webinars would occur. She has the technical skills and all the abilities that I don't to make these webinars happen, to make sure we get all the information out as much as we humanly can with the technological tools that are out there. So I want to thank the guests and our participant, Suzanne Bailey-Rice and Jane. And with that, I'll let Jane and then Suzanne offer their closing remarks.
Thank you, Lawrence. It's been a fantastic pleasure to have you here tonight, Susan. A very interesting topic that comes up time and time again. I'm sure we'll continue to do so over the remainder of the school year and the following school year. It'd be lovely to have you back again to talk in some more detail. In addition to this webinar, the JumpStars, that's a partnership between the Stamford JCC and Start Inc., which is a wonderful organisation located in Norwalk. We do provide not only this free educational webinar series, but we provide recreational in-person activities for parents and caregivers within our communities too. We have some great in-person events coming up, so please look at those activities on our Instagram page and Facebook pages, JumpStars. I hope to meet you at some of those events. In the meantime, if you need any support or help, please do not hesitate to reach out to myself, Suzanne, or Lawrence on this subject, and for Lawrence and I, other matters as well. So thank you, Suzanne, for taking the time to come tonight. That was a fantastic presentation with a tremendous amount of information and detail.
Thank you very much. And I tried to fit as much as I possibly could in the slides, knowing that it's just such a huge topic to get to in a short time. There's just so much information and so many resources. So please, go through the slides. I tried to answer as many in the Q&A as I possibly could while we were finishing up and answering the questions. But I didn't get to all of them. And obviously we didn't get to all of the questions. So I am available, quick phone calls, an email, a text, reach out, and I'm happy to, provide as much information as I can or answer any of the questions that we didn't get to. So anytime, just reach out and I'm happy to get back to you as soon as I can.
Well, thank you very much. Remember, a lot of information is in the chat section on the right side of the computer screen. You'll get a copy of the recording if you've registered. And I want to thank both of you, and Jane and I will see our registrants on March 12th. Good night.
Good night.